Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Age Group Triathlon podcast. My name is Simon Olney, I'm a professional triathlon coach, and in this week's episode we're going to be looking at triathlon bikes. So sort of whether you need one, when the best time is to buy one, as well as looking at a few tips to help you get up and running with a potential triathlon bike. Now, I want to take the time to express here that all triathlon bikes can be a triathlon bike. It can be a mountain bike, a hybrid bike, a road bike, a fat bike, a shopping bike. Any bike that is legal to be used within a race can be a triathlon bike in itself. What I am referring to for the purposes of this episode is a bike designed specifically for triathlon and maximum speed during a triathlon. Now, these can be known as time trial bikes. I'm going to use the term triathlon bike because there are people out there who, will say, I guess quite rightly, there is a difference between a triathlon bike and a time trial bike. A time trial bike will tend to be UCI legal, which means that it follows all of the rules for the international, I'm not going to try and pronounce it in French, but the governing body of cycling, the UCI, they have measurements about sort of the inner triangle and the geometry of the frame. And these time trial bikes are generally meant to be ridden for a shorter space of time, and they fit these specs. Whereas sort of triathlon bikes, they can be any kind of shape. Really, it gives the manufacturer a lot more flexibility when it comes to sort of the design aspects of them. You'll see some of them will be missing the top tubes, all sorts of interesting things going on. So it's for that's just sort of a bit of a glossary to take you over what it is that I'm referring to. So I'm referring to any kind of bike where you spend most of your time lying out on the aero bars in front of the bike. And if you then go to put your hands on what are known as the bull horns or the base bar, you can't change your gears from there, you only have the brakes. If you are a little bit lost, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, Google triathlon bike, look at the shapes of the bikes there. You'll likely have seen pretty much every professional triathlete over the 70.3 and Ironman distance using one. Just a quick run around of the terminology that I'm going to be using so you don't feel left behind. So I guess, starting from the bottom a bit, why would somebody want to ride in a more uncomfortable position where they have less control over the bike? Well, because it is what's known as more aerodynamic, it's going to be faster on the flats. When we are cycling, the thing that slows us down the most is the drag created by sort of the air. So we're trying to punch a hole through the air. And the faster that we go, the harder it becomes to punch this hole through the air. As an example, if somebody were to go from riding 0 miles an hour up to 10 miles an hour, there's not going to be a huge amount of difference there. I mean, you are going to know that you're moving, but it's going to be exponentially harder to hit 20 miles an hour than it did 10 miles an hour. And if they want to hit 30 miles an hour, it becomes harder the faster you get to punch this hole through the air. And what these bikes are designed to do is they're designed to push the smallest hole through the air possible. So by bringing your arms together and lying out on the front of the bike, a bit like a sort of a praying mantis, you are vastly reducing the amount of drag that you create. Now, on a bike, around about 10% of the drag is created by the bike frame itself. Around about 90% of the drag comes from the rider and the rider's position. Now, this is a very important point to remember as we go forward. Now, by bringing your arms to the centre of the bike, you're pulling your shoulders in, and you're also lowering your body, your center of gravity down, creating yourself a nice, really quite compact shape. Now, if you look at head-on shots of professional triathletes or of professional cyclists riding time trials, you can see that you can see their head and their arms are not an awful lot else. It's all tucked up into this very sort of pleasing shape. And this will also be accompanied by, most of the time, wearing a slightly strangely shaped helmet known as an aero helmet. And, all sorts of other bits such as deep section wheels, disc wheels, maybe shoe covers. These are all items which are used to minimize drag as much as possible. Now, you may think to yourself, hang on, if this is the fastest way to get around, doesn't everybody just cruise around town on these bikes? I'm sure they could be made for cheap. And yes, if you wanted to get a steel bike with aero bars on the front, yeah, you could get that done relatively reasonably. But the reason that people don't go around like this, well, firstly, is that if somebody is going out for a ride with a group, then you will save much more time riding behind another rider than you would in this, what I'm going to call the time trial position. So if I refer to the time trial position, I'm referring to when somebody's arms are on the aero bars as opposed to when they are sat up on the bull horns, which will they be holding on to sort of what replaces the handlebars for a cyclist. So you'll be much faster on a road bike riding behind another rider than you would be on a time trial bike riding solo. But because triathlon is a non-drafting sport for the most part, so you cannot ride behind another rider and you cannot gain an advantage by following them. But what you can do is you can get yourself as aerodynamic as possible. Okay, that is going to provide you with a much greater sort of benefit when you're riding solo. So triathlon bikes and TT bikes are just for riding solo, whereas road bikes are, for riding in groups or just for more sort of casual sort of general fitness riding. Now, another reason that we don't want to take a TT bike when we're on a group ride is that the only time that you have access to the brakes when you're on a time trial bike or triathlon bike is when you are sort of sat quite upright on it. Now, when you're in this position on the bull horns, then it's not very comfortable. It's definitely not very aerodynamic, and you only really get up into that position to use the brakes to go around corners. The idea would be that as soon as you're around that corner, or maybe even within the corner itself, you get back into the time trial position and you will go again. Now, if you are riding in a group, because you don't have access to the brakes when you're in the time trial position, it's really not very safe for you to ride in a group. Because if somebody in front of you slows down, you've got zero time to be able to react to this and to be able to stop the bike. And you will crash into the back of them, which is going to be unfortunate for both of you. So the only way to get around this would be if you were to spend the entire group ride on the bull horns. Yes, that would be completely safe, but you'd also have to reach forwards to the aero bar extensions to be able to change gear, which again, it's not the end of the world, but it is a bit cumbersome. It's not very comfortable, and it's not really the best way to do it. So I don't recommend, for many people at least, that you only go with a time trial bike. If you are new to triathlon and you've got the budget to get yourself a triathlon bike, time trial bike. I know I'm using those terms interchangeably now. Apologise for that, but sort of referring to both really. If you have the budget to get yourself a triathlon bike and you think, you know what, I'm a triathlete, I need to get myself a triathlon bike, just know that it is going to restrict the kind of riding that you can do. I know I speak to a lot of people in London, clients of mine, who have a budget to get some nice gear, and I say, look, if you want to do any riding around London, and certainly if your rides are going to start from London, you have to pick your way through traffic. A tri-bike isn't really the best way to do that. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to have access to the gears and the brakes in the same way, and you may want to consider having a road bike if you want to ride to work, if you want to do any sort of riding around the city itself. Whereas if somebody was in the countryside and they had no interest in riding with everyone else, could they do all their riding on a triathlon bike? Yeah, I guess they could. I know that some professional triathletes, they ride their triathlon bike all year round. So most people, including myself, will ride their triathlon bike in the summer months, and then when it gets to the colder months, when it gets to the winter, then they'll switch to their road bike, which generally is a bit more sort of rugged. And those who do ride their triathlon bike all the way through winter, they have a very meticulous cleaning schedule after every ride, which as an amateur you may not have time for. So I think it always helps to have a road bike that you can fall back on. If, for instance, there is a problem with your time trial bike and it needs to go into the shop, it's going to take some time, you need some parts. It's nice to be able to have a road bike. It doesn't have to cost the earth, but it's nice to have a road bike to fall back on. So I recommend that everyone starts with a road bike and then moves up to getting this triathlon bike as and when they feel ready, which sort of brings us on to sort of the topic of the podcast really, which is, well, when is the right time to invest in a triathlon bike? Now, triathlon bikes are not cheap, and that's an understatement. Partly it's because they are a specialist product and they don't make many of them. So anything which has a limited production run is going to be more expensive than something which is really truly mass produced. However, it's also the fact that because it is a performance piece of machinery, nobody gets a triathlon bike just for larks. Somebody's going to get a triathlon bike if they want to be the best version of themselves during their race. And as a result, they tend to be sort of nice quality frames, made with good quality materials. They are not skimping on any of the any of the qualities here. They want to, even your very cheapest triathlon bike is still probably going to be carbon fibre. There might be a few out there which are aluminium, but I think nearly all of the ones that spring to mind at least are carbon fibre. And this just comes with a price tag, really. I think that I remember when I was working in a bike shop 6 or 7 years ago now, you'd be looking around about 1,500 for your very entry level triathlon bike, and closer to £2,000. In fact, let me check now. Okay, so I had a quick check and it's even worse than I thought. It's about 2.5 now. I'm looking at the Cervelo P2, which is sort of the entry-level triathlon bike that Cervelo make. Cervelo are a very established triathlon manufacturer. I'm sure there are sort of other bikes out there that you could get for a similar price. But they are sort of well respected as being good quality. Now, I'm sure you could get cheaper bikes from other manufacturers, but as Cervelo is the most popular, I tend to use them as a bit of a yardstick. So yeah, £2,500 for a Cervelo P2, which again, this is the kind of investment that you really have to, most of us at least, have to think quite carefully about and think, okay, is this really something that I need right now? And a lot of this, it depends on the kind of events that you're doing and where you are in your triathlon journey. So let's look at the first point. What kind of events is it that you're doing? Now, if you are doing a sprint triathlon, then you may have very little need to sort of get yourself a triathlon bike, really. If I said the words Crystal Palace Triathlon, I'm sure that at least a few of you will know what I mean here. It's a event that is held in sort of, it's not central London, but it's well within the M25, Crystal Palace. I'm sure some of you know the football team at the very least. And it was 7 laps around this criterium circuit that they have. And there were a lot of riders on the course, and honestly, it was a bit like Mario Kart. I remember I was going up, there's a sort of a steep bit of a hill, and I think we were 6 or 7 bikes wide, and I had to go round somebody on the grass to be able to avoid going into the back of them. And I know this is sort of an entry-level sprint triathlon. It's I'm not sort of angry that people are going slow on the hill. But the fact is that I was not able to use the bars on my triathlon bike very much at all. It was a twisty, turny course. There were lots of people around. I wanted full control of the bike. If you then compare this to a race such as Ironman Texas, which I think is really sort of one of the flattest events out there, it's night and day. A triathlon bike was the wrong choice to take to Crystal Palace. I would have been better off on my road bike, I think. Whereas if I took my road bike to Ironman Texas, I'd be giving away time hand over fist, really. So the flatter that a course is and the less technical that a course is, the more that you would be sort of inclined to look at a triathlon bike. Now, there is a question that's often floated around triathletes, and it generates a fair bit of discussion, which is, would a course ever be hilly enough to warrant taking a road bike over a triathlon bike? would it ever be outright faster to be on a road bike? Now, for a course to be fast on a road bike, it would have to be very hilly, it would have to be very technical. And of course, there are some examples of breakthrough athletes winning. Gustav Eden won the Ironman 70.3 World Championships in, I want to say, 2017 on a very hilly bike course on a road bike. But the chances are that he could have won that same event on a time trial bike and maybe even had a greater winning margin. I don't think he necessarily knew that the road bike was going to be faster so much as that's what he had and that's what he had experience riding. I think he was just coming over from riding short course events, and this is something that he felt most confident with. And given the terrain, he knew that he at least had a shout. If it was an absolutely flat race, then he would have been a bit of a mug to bring a road bike, but it was a hilly course. He rolled the dice and it worked for him. Additionally, Taylor Knibb at the Collins Cup, back when that was a thing, a few years ago. She won her event on a road bike. I seem to remember that she had clip-on aero bars with that bike. I can't remember if Gustav did for his 70.3 victory. I'd be surprised if he didn't. But they have what they call clip-on aero bars, which are an accessory that you can buy. They're not overly expensive. You can get some that cost about £30, £35. You attach them to your handlebars and they allow you to rest your arms out in front of the bike as if you're on a time trial bike. And they are some of the best money that you can spend to be able to get, sort of a free speed, as it were. There are a few downsides to them, which I'm going to touch on later. Now, the upside to bringing a road bike over a triathlon bike, which is what might make us consider one, is that road bikes are just lighter. There is less material used on a road bike, and because weight is such an important factor for road cycling, where races are decided often on hills. They have done everything they can to cut down on the weight of the bike as possible. However, there are very few triathlons where weight is an absolutely massive issue, and it's far more common that aerodynamics is what's going to win the day. So if a triathlon bike manufacturer has the choice between, do we make a bike lighter but less aerodynamic, or a bit heavier and more aerodynamic, they will always on the aerodynamic side of things. Now, this is a balance. I'm sure that there are some bikes which could be much more aerodynamic if they were sort of 1 to 3 kilograms heavier, but there will come a point where people just aren't going to buy a bike that is that much heavier, because there are very few courses which are absolutely pancake flat. And people will feel they're going to lose time on a bike that's too heavy. The other reason that you might want a road bike is that they handle much better than triathlon bikes do, especially on the descents. It's a combination of the sort of the front end of the bike, what we call the stem, and that cockpit area. You just often can't turn the handlebars on a triathlon bike quite as far as you can on a road bike. A road bike, you should be able to twist the handlebars around some ridiculous angle that you'd never need. Whereas with triathlon bikes, if you're travelling at a very slow speed and trying to negotiate a hairpin, then you may run out of steering in some extreme cases. But even if you have enough steering to be able to get around the corner, due to the shorter wheelbase that you have on a triathlon bike, additionally the way it's distributed over the bottom bracket, they just don't corner like they're on rails. Like a road bike might. It's always going to feel a bit cumbersome, it's going to feel a bit clumsy. And if you were, say, doing a race that had a number of hills, and you have this one last hill before transition, you could have one athlete who would be on a road bike, who could fly up the hill, could make the advantage of the fact they have an extra sort of 1 or 2 kilograms on everybody else, due to the fact it's a road bike rather than a triathlon bike. I'm not sure actually what the difference would be between a super light bike like, say, an Amonda, as opposed to something like a CAD-X, a real high-end triathlon bike. But I'll be interested to know. But unfortunately, these statistics aren't widely available because brands tend to keep the weight of their products a little close to their chest in most cases. But nonetheless, you could have this rider who can get a gap on the uphill. It may only be sort of 10 seconds, 20 seconds, but they can then descend, drop like a stone down the other side of the hill back towards transition, and open up, say, another 20 seconds. Before you know it, you could have yourself, a nice comfortable 20-30 second gap on the rest of the field going into transition. Now, if after that descent there is flat for another 10 kilometres, then the time trial bike's going to catch you up and it's going to be much for muchness. And it's triathlon. At the end of the day, we don't win the race on the bike course, but if you are able to ride up the hill with more efficiency and you're able to descend faster, that is free speed. You didn't have to work harder for that gap. And so, you could say, well, that there could definitely be an argument for doing that. The counter argument would be that if it's, say, an Ironman 70.3 course, okay, and for the first kind of 70-80 kilometres, it's pan flat, and then you get to the hill right at the end, then the athlete on the road bike isn't going to be within that lead kind of group of athletes, okay? They're going to be much further behind because they are sacrificing their aerodynamics for that extra time on the hill at the end. And is that really going to pay off? I'd say sort of 9 times out of 10, no, it probably won't. Aerodynamics is of such critical importance in triathlon that for my money, it would, again, it have to be something super hilly, super steep, something like the Alpe d'Huez triathlon for me to think to myself, right, okay, I really think I'm better off taking a road bike here. So if somebody were to ask me, Simon, will I be faster on a triathlon bike? Then the chances are that 9 times out of 10, the answer would be yes. You will be faster on a triathlon bike. As long as you get practice in riding that bike, okay, you should be absolutely fine. You will go faster. Which begs the question, well, how much faster am I going to get? People are going to be looking at this from a return on investment, because it is a return, literally, on a financial investment. How much faster is it going to make me? And the sort of the rough, and this is like incredibly rough, I'm going to say around about 10 minutes for 70.3. And I'm going to say roughly about 20 minutes for an Ironman. Now these are very rough numbers, and it's incredibly hard to give a hard and fast answer, because if somebody's in a very efficient position on a road bike and they've got clip-on aero bars, they've got some deeper wheels, they've got an aero helmet, and they've really optimized their road bike setup, then switching over to a triathlon bike may not actually provide them with as much gains as they were expecting, because they were already relatively optimized with the road bike setup they had. However, it will still make them faster. That will be due to sort of what I guess is sort of where the differences come from, really, is it comes from having the gears at the end of the aero bars. Now, some of you may well say, yes, but you can mount sort of put bar end shifters on a road bike. You can sort of retrofit them into the clip-on aero bars, and you shift from there. And yeah, that is absolutely the case. In fact, you could even get yourself a base bar and aero bars, and you could attach that to a road bike, and you could have sort of a triathlon bike essentially from the stem onwards. However, it is time, money, it's effort to get all that set up. And if you then decide that you want to ride your road bike normally, then you might need to, or when it comes to winter and you don't want to be in that position, then have to sort of rewire everything back into the hoods. I mean, it can be done, but it's just a little bit messy for me personally, at least, sort of retrofitting bar end shifters onto a road bike. So having the ability to shift on the aero bars is really quite big for me, at least, because if I am riding my road bike with clip-on aero bars, every time that the road kicks up or every time the road dips down, Every time I approach a corner and I know that I'm going to sort of want to change down gear, I have to go from being in the aero position to reach around to drop down or change up some gears with normally my right hand. Obviously I'll use my left if I'm looking to change chain rings. And it's messy. It will mess up with the aerodynamics in the airflow, and it's not going to make a massive difference. But it is going to feel junky. You are going to find excuses not to change gears because it's inefficient, rather than changing to a more efficient gear because you don't want to be reaching around. And also from a bike control perspective, if you are riding along your aero bars and you go to shift down, and you got one hand on the bars and one hand reaching round for the gear shifter, and you hit a hole that you hadn't have spotted, your chances of crashing are that much higher if you've only got one arm on the aero bars. Whereas if you've got both arms on the aero bars at all times and you're shifting from that position, it is a lot more comfortable. It's a lot more efficient. Is it worth $2,500? No, probably not. But I'm just sort of listing the benefits really of the frames here. The other benefit is the actual shape of the frame itself. So this is, the way that the bike frame is optimized for airflow. So that could be bits being narrower, some bits being wider to kind of try and sort of funnel the air through. The whole design of the bike will be built around aerodynamics. There won't be round tubing. Okay, it'll be nice tapered tubing. And, it's going to look very pretty. It's going to look very nice. Very modern. But the thing you have to remember here is that the bike, as I said at the start of the episode, the bike only equates for 10% of the drag, roughly speaking. Again, if somebody is sat bolt upright on their bike with their rain jacket wide open and flapping in the wind, okay, then the bike is going to be creating much less than 10% of the drag. Equally, if somebody is super tucked up, super aero optimized, then it may be the bike is responsible for a bit more than 10%. But I think 10% is generally accepted as being a sort of a reasonable figure. So if we are looking at the bike being responsible for 10% of drag, and we can reduce the drag that's created by that bike by 10%, that's only really a 1% reduction in overall drag. And this is something that's really important to remember when we're bike shopping. Because if we want to look at the very top end of triathlon bikes, we are going to see rapidly what we call diminishing returns. So the difference between a road bike and a triathlon bike can be relatively big, in the same way that the difference between a hybrid bike and a road bike would be quite big. But as with road bikes, the difference between a £1,000 bike and say like a £5,000 bike isn't actually that massive, okay? It might be about a kilo lighter. It might have some fancier components which shift a bit quicker. It might have a really nice paint job. But we're not breaking huge amounts of new ground here. And the same is true with triathlon bikes, because the shape that you get your body into, having the access to those shifters, is the most important part. The exact shape of that frame is not actually that massive. It doesn't actually make that big a deal. Now, if I was a professional triathlete and I wanted to absolutely get the most possible from my triathlon bike, then going for this very top of the range bike as opposed to an entry level bike could well be the difference between me being in the lead bike pack or not. Because although it is only adding another like 1 or 2%, okay, to my efficiency, that could be all it takes. I mean, if we're looking at somebody who is riding at 200 watts, okay, that could be around about 4 watts that they save by having this top end frame as opposed to a lower end frame. And when you add up all of the benefit that could make over the course of an Ironman, I mean, if somebody were to gain 5 watts to their FTP, they'd be pretty happy with that. So if money isn't an object, okay, and you absolutely want to be the most efficient that you possibly can, yeah, by all means go for that very top end bike. but I'm going to drop in something now which is going to be a bit controversial. It might upset a few of you. If you are a very average, middle of the pack triathlete, weekend warrior, you don't need to drop 10 grand on a top end triathlon bike. I get that, you might like to spend money, and it's no doubt going to be an excellent bike and you may really enjoy riding it, but you're going to get there on race day and you're going to be passed by lots of people on road bikes or on bikes that cost a 20th of what yours did, and it's just not a great feeling. If you are really sort of close to your potential, if you're right at the top end of things, if you're looking at qualifying for world championships, winning competitive age groups, okay, then yeah, going for that really top end triathlon bike might actually really make a difference. But if you're riding an Ironman bike split in around about 6-7 hours, okay, then it just doesn't warrant dropping that amount of cash on a very small improvement. I'm sorry, but it's that there are much better places for you to be sort of investing money. I'm not saying don't spend money on the sport. There are much better places to be investing than on the bike frame. Now, power meters, wheels, aerodynamic helmets, these are all important. These will really make a difference. But if you've got some money to spend, and I've got no problem with that. If you're looking at, well, do I get this 5 grand triathlon frame, which is absolutely brilliant, or do I get this 10 grand triathlon frame, which is 5% faster? Okay. By going for that 10 grand bike, you're never actually really going to get the potential out of that. At least, not within the first few years. It may be that as time goes by, you do more training, you do more racing, and you can really start to get close to making the most of that purchase. But don't get to the point where you're stretching your budget to something you're not sure if you can really afford it, but the marketing's brought you in. You've read about how aerodynamic is and all these features that they have, okay? It is better to go for something that's a little bit cheaper, but you will be able to ride. If you sort of dent it or scratch it or crash it, it's not the end of the world in quite the same way. Now, to use myself as an example here, when I was looking at getting my triathlon bike, I was working at a bike shop at the time, and I could get a cycle to work scheme. So between the cycle to work scheme and between my staff discount at the bike shop, I could get a bike for, a really good price. So at the time, I had a choice between 3 models. Looking at the Cervelo range, which at the shop that I worked at was the premium sort of manufacturer, is the one that I was looking at. So there was the P2, there was the P3, and there was the P5. Now the P2 at the time I think was around £1,500, maybe £1,700. The P3 was closer to about £3,000, and the P5 I think was closer to £7,000 off the top of my head. It really was a big step up. I looked at the difference between the P2 and the P3. And the P2, it had aluminium handlebars as opposed to aluminium base bar as opposed to carbon fibre on the P3. And the group set was 105 on that P2 as opposed to Ultegra on the P3. And I looked at them and sort of looked at the weight difference and that, and I thought, look, I can justify. Because, this may be the only time that I can, realistically afford to drop this much money on a bike at once. I want to get a bike that is going to last me for decades. I'm going to make the investment to get the P3. I think it was warranted. I think if I'd have gone for the P2, I may well have ended up being may have ended up sort of regretting that decision. But I could afford the P3 with all of the discounts that I had and spread the cost out. But the P5, maybe I could have afforded an absolute push, but I knew deep down I didn't have the talent, I didn't have the legs, I didn't have the fitness, I didn't have the bike handling capabilities to really do that bike justice. And I would have felt like an absolute lemon if I was on a bike course at a local triathlon on a P5 and getting overtaken by people on a specialised alley, which would have happened. So I saved the money, I went on something that was still an absolutely brilliant bike. It was maybe only 5% slower than the P5. And I've not regretted that decision once. I've not looked at any triathlon bikes that have come out since and thought, oh, that's so much better than my P3. Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of you who own P3s who might be nodding along to this right now and going, yep, it is an absolutely brilliant bike. I'm super happy with it. And it's tempting again. If you're in a financial position where you can afford to say, oh yeah, I get this, I get the top end of this, I get the top end of this, but you can end up with a bit of buyer's remorse and the kind of, I'm not saying like the embarrassment, but if you take this 10 grand bike to sort of a 3 hour bike split over a 70.3, you are going to feel a bit disheartened, because you would have seen yourself passed by a lot of people who were on bikes that were a hell of a lot cheaper than yours. Kind of thinking, well, what is it that I spent all that money for then? And of course, on the run, no amount of bike is going to help you either. So, again, it depends on your individual position, it depends on your values. But if you are considering a triathlon bike, you've never owned a triathlon bike before, and you're going, right, do I go for this? Do I go for a really solid, good quality option or the very top of the range model? My recommendation 9 times out of 10 would be, look, just go for a really solid bike. And my plan, if my business really takes off and I find myself with a huge amount of disposable income, yeah, you know what? I might go and I might get myself a really nice triathlon bike. But for now, I know that the P3 it's realistically all the bike that I need to actually make a difference with the sort of the levels of fitness that I have currently. Now, another reason to get a triathlon bike, and actually something that might steer me towards a more expensive model, actually, is the ability to carry more nutrition, more fluid. Now, some triathlon bikes have sort of interior bladders which can slip inside the frame and allow you to carry more nutrition. I think that's a fantastic idea personally. I know that there are some bikes which have sort of compartments within sort of around the bottom bracket where you can place tools. Again, I think it's a brilliant idea. Tuck them already down there. You know that you've got your puncture repair kit, you've got your Allen keys, you've got your mini tool, your spare chain bits. All those are in there if they're ever needed, but chances are they won't be needed. But they are out of sight, they're out of mind down there. And additionally, some just have additional, I think they call them fuel cells. I think Triathlon sort of specialised their triathlon bikes. I think they call them the fuel cell. Different areas where you can stuff in bits of nutrition, which are really useful. And I definitely encourage people to to consider this as being a good reason to maybe spend a little bit more on a bike. Now, I know that the Meistervelo P3 is an example. It's got 2 bolts on the top tube that allow you to screw in a little pouch where you can hold some extra food, as opposed to having one attached to the top tube via Velcro, which tends to flop around a little bit. Again, these little touches are good reasons to look at triathlon bikes and good considerations to make when you're trying to decide on a triathlon bike. Now, on the subject of whether somebody is ready for a triathlon bike, you also have to consider somebody's bike handling skills. Now, I would make it an absolute prerequisite before anybody thinks about buying a triathlon bike to at least have a go with a road bike with clip-on aero bars. Because if you have a go with a road bike with clip-on aero bars and you find it a really horrible experience, that you either it's going to take you a lot of time to get your head around, or you have no desire to get your head around it. You may think to yourself, you know what, I can't do it, it's too scary, it's not for me. You know what, that's fine, there's no huge amount of pressure there. But you do at least need to try this before you invest in a triathlon bike, because I want you to have a bike that, at the end of the day, you can ride. And it's not just the bike handling skills that you need to have. You also need to have the flexibility and the mobility to be able to get yourself into a decent time trial position. Now, when I look at some photos of me racing my bike shortly after I got my triathlon bike, I think I look pretty upright on that. I don't look a huge amount more aerodynamic than I did on my road bike. That's not to say that I wasn't faster on that bike, especially as the race in question. If any of you have raced at Eton Dorney, I remember we were riding on that bit that goes down the centre of the between the two lakes, and there was a howling, absolutely howling headwind. And I remember riding on my triathlon bike, and I was just cutting through all of the people on road bikes who was there absolutely out the saddle trying to push themselves along, just tucked up, sailing through. But that's not to say that I couldn't have been faster if I wasn't in a more aggressive position. Now, being in a more aggressive position, yes, it is about getting yourself more comfortable, more used to being in these positions, but it's also about the mobility, the strength, the flexibility, all of this that comes with getting yourself ready to hold that position for a long time. Because if you're doing an Ironman and you have gone and you have bought yourself a 10 grand bike, you better make sure that you're able to hold that aero position for the entire 180 kilometers of that bike ride. Obviously excluding corners and hills and the like. But if you get 40k in and you're having to sit up and stretch your back out, you can have a really rough rest of the ride. Not only because you're not in that aero position, you're not making the most of the bike that you bought, but also being on the bullhorns. Generally speaking, if you get a triathlon bike fitted, then they don't take into account your position on the bullhorns. Everything is optimized for being in that aero position, so it is not going to be comfortable being there on those bullhorns. Speaking of bike fits, I recommend that you find a sort of a bike fitter to fit you before you buy the bike. The reason for this is that if you order yourself a triathlon bike and it is the wrong size, then you're going to find yourself in a lot of problems. Now, I remember when I was looking at getting my P3, I was on the, I was either going to be, I think it was a 52 or a 54 off the top of my head. And I was chatting to one of the guys in the bike shop that I worked at, the sales department. We do my measurements, take the, measure the inseam, my height, and put it into the calculator and go, yeah, you're going to need a 54. So put the order in for 54. And a bike fit with the bike fitter to sort of to check, to get the measurements right, so that the bike could be built to my measurements before I even sort of touched the before sort of the bike even got there. So I could come right out of the workshop and I could ride it home. And we did the bike fit. He got me on the jig, and we took these measurements. Looked at it, and he's looking at it, and he's going, "Look, I think honestly, you're better off with a 52. Like, we could fit you on a 54, but the saddle would be right down as low as it could be, and it just wouldn't look right." So we ordered the 52, and it just looks a lot more normal. If you are ever buying a bike and you're between, do I go for the larger frame, do I go for the smaller frame? Always go for the smaller frame. The reason being is that it is an awful lot easier to make a bike bigger than it is to make a bike smaller. If you get a frame that's a little bit too small, then we can play around with the stem length and the bars and the saddle to an extent to try to make that bike more comfortable. If you buy a bike that is simply too large, there's only really so much we can do about that. So yes, if possible, if you're looking to buy a triathlon bike, go to a retailer where they have an in-house bike fitter that can help you pick out the right triathlon bike for you, get all the measurements for you, and then the mechanics will set that up to those measurements. It's probably worth double checking those measurements yourself when you do get the bike against what it is that the bike fitter gave you. But they will be able to set it up for your level of mobility and flexibility. So I think those are all the points that I wanted to make, really. Now, something to consider is if you are training for a 70.3 and you look at the amount of time that a bike could save you, and as you know, I've said, very ballpark, if you were to buy yourself a triathlon bike, you could save around about 10 minutes. Now, 10 minutes may not sound like a lot of time. And I mean, realistically, it's not. As I'm looking at this podcast and I'm recording it, I'm just about to approach the 45-minute mark. So you've already been listening to this for 45 minutes. 10 minutes, it's not an enormous amount of time. But if you were racing and you got a penalty and you had to stop and you had to wait at the bike dismount line for 10 minutes, and during those 10 minutes you watched all of these dozens of athletes get off their bike, do their transition to, and then run out on the run, that's going to feel like an incredibly long 10 minutes. And if you are somebody who just wants to complete a 70.3, if you just want to go out and do one race, do not get a triathlon bike. Please don't get a triathlon bike. You don't need one. It's not essential, and those 10 minutes aren't going to make a huge difference to you. If, however, you've done a few triathlons at least, I mean, I think I got the bike in 2017, and I started the sport in 2012. So yeah, I waited 5 years to get my triathlon bike. If you have been doing if you have done sort of several races and you really think that the bike, that sort of a road bike, is what's holding you back, and you just can't get yourself quite happy on a road bike with aero bars. I mean, that is something I did forget to mention earlier, is that if you do get aero bars on a road bike, you will need to move the saddle forward a little bit to be able to get yourself comfortable. The downside to this being is that if you then want to ride on the hoods like it was a normal road bike, then the position is altered there, and it's really, really, really difficult, in fact almost impossible in most cases, to get a bike fit that is comfortable in both sort of road position and aero bar position. So that is another reason to consider a triathlon bike. At the end of the day, though, let's be honest, 10 minutes is 10 minutes. And if we are looking at an Ironman, and we could even make up to 20 minutes, again, that might be a slightly generous estimate there. I'll be honest, it depends on a huge amount of factors. But even if it's sort of 15 minutes, that is an enormous amount of time. I mean, think how pleased someone would be if they could take 15 minutes off of their marathon time over an Ironman. That would be immense. That would be huge. So this is one of the areas where, unfortunately, we can buy speed. Now, talking of buying speed, I'm not going to go into them in a huge amount of detail here, but other areas you can look at to improve aerodynamics on the bike are, the two biggest players are aero helmets and aero wheels. Now, an aero helmet is really a bit of a no-brainer for me. You can get one for, again, it depends on the brand that you go for. Start generally at the kind of £100-150 mark, might be a bit more these days. You can pay an enormous amount for these aero helmets, but again, diminishing returns and all that. You can get yourself a really nice one for £150. It can save you as much time, in many cases, as a really nice set of deep section and disc wheel. So that £150 aero helmet could save you as much time as sort of 4 or 5 grand's worth of carbon wheels. Okay, it just makes sense. And now, I am not saying that it's not worth upgrading your wheels, but as far as investments in triathlon go, realistically, you are going to get the lowest return on investment from deep section and disc wheels relative to any other expense in triathlon. Again, I'm not saying it's not worth it. If you could save even 2 or 3 minutes over a race by running these deep section wheels, maybe a disc on the back, okay, that is 2 or 3 minutes. You can have a head start on the run compared to your competition, which, if you are trying to qualify for a World Championship event, for instance, is absolutely massive. It's absolutely enormous. So, I'm not saying don't buy them. I'm just saying these should be one of the last things you consider buying. You would be looking at getting really top-end wheels if you have, again, really nice triathlon bike frame, great aero helmet, you've got yourself a really sort of decent wetsuit, good, some super shoes, some pretty reasonable upgrades on your bike. Again, not saying you need to go like full ceramic bearings, but you want to make sure that you've optimized most areas of your other areas of your bike already. You've got yourself a good coach, okay, and all of these other expenses. Once you got all of those in place, that's when you can consider looking at the really nice fancy wheels. Until then, they just don't provide the return on investment. I mean, especially when you consider how often it is that you use them. You mainly ride them sort of once, maybe twice a year in some cases. You really do want to make sure that you've got everything else in place before you start looking at these really fancy wheels. So to conclude, to answer the question at the top of the show, do you need a triathlon bike? And the answer is no, nobody needs a triathlon bike. However, that doesn't mean that a triathlon bike won't be more comfortable, make you faster, be more ergonomic, and set you up for a better run. In fact, just as I say that, it's reminded me of one aspect of the triathlon bike that I haven't mentioned that I will go back and drop in. It's easier for me to drop in here at the end than it is to go back and try and shoehorn it into the episode. And that is the position that you are riding on a triathlon bike when you're slightly further forward than you would be on a road bike. It's supposed to set you up better for the run due to hip angles and the like. Again, I'm not a bike fitter, I can't pretend to know everything, but the position that you're in on that bike is supposed to be much easier to transition to running from that position on a triathlon bike. And there we have it. Okay, that is a bit of a rundown on sort of everything related to triathlon bikes and hopefully decisions that you need to make. Now, if you have any questions, any follow-up questions, things I might not have covered, feel free to send me an email. My email address is down in the show notes. If you're looking at optimizing your triathlon performance and you haven't got yourself a triathlon coach yet, I'm going to drop a link that will just tell you all about my bespoke coaching. Make sure you have a look at that. And otherwise, I really hope you have a fantastic week of training ahead of you. Hope you will stay safe, and I'll see you all next Tuesday morning.